Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. This is a wonky, fakakta, however, whatever terms you want to use, kind of week because it's the holiday. I got a head cold. I'm in New York City with my daughter, and so this is probably the only conversational Remnant we're going to do this week. And so we wanted to make it count. And since it's Thanksgiving week, for reasons that we can discuss, and in fact, reasons we will discuss, Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays. It's probably my favorite holiday. And it's also, weirdly, given all the stuff I say about nationalism, probably America's most important nationalist holiday for reasons we can discuss. And when I think of gratitude as a serious concept, there are basically two people I think of. One is William F. Buckley, who wrote a book called Gratitude. And the other one is Yuval Levin, who famously defined conservatism as gratitude. William F. Buckley would be the bigger get for a conversation
today.
That
would be impressive, Jonah.
But barring that, when you can't get William F. Buckley, you get Yuval Levin, my boss at the American Enterprise Institute, not the boss of bosses, the capo di tutti capo, but the underboss at the American Enterprise Institute, the head of the social, cultural, political, constitutional, rabbinical studies department at the American Enterprise Institute, Yuval Levin. I will stop talking now. Yuval, welcome back to Remnant.
Thanks very much, Jonah. The secret is, of course, that it's all rabbinical study.
That's right.
The whole thing.
It's rabbis all the way down. So why don't we just sort of start there? There are a bunch of tangents we can go on, and there are a bunch of wonky things we can get into, but it is Thanksgiving, and or many people will be listening to this on or about Thanksgiving. And you famously, at least in my world, when I think it was when you got the Bradley Prize, you gave a little talk about how conservatism is gratitude, and it's always stuck with me. It was a big part of Suicide of the West, this argument. So why don't you sort of make that case, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you. It is Thanksgiving, so thank you. And thank you for having me and for the Dispatch and for all the things you do. I think of gratitude as fundamentally connected to the conservative disposition. It's a way of approaching the world by recognizing that we didn't make it. We don't necessarily earn it. We don't necessarily deserve it. But it offers us a lot of good. And we should begin by recognizing that it is, in many respects, more than we deserve. Also, that it is vulnerable, that it isn't just here for us to use as a resource, but requires our engagement, our commitment. And that has to begin with a sense of appreciation for what living in a free society offers us, for what living in a family, in a community offers us. And before we can think about how to improve all those things and how to change them and what's wrong with them, we have to see that there is a lot that's right with them, and that they didn't have to be this way, that it took a lot of work over a lot of time to get to a point where we can have a whole society of people who are more or less capable of freedom, that is an incredible social achievement, and that first and foremost, we've got to see it that way, be grateful for it, recognize our own limitations, and work from there. So I think gratitude is connected to humility. It's connected to a sense of our own limits. And in all those ways, it's deeply connected to conservatism. What we want to conserve are the preconditions for the good life. And in order to do that well, we first have to be grateful for them and grateful for being able to live well in a good society, which we do.
So there's a word you left out there. I'm sure you don't disagree. That's important, which is memory.
Absolutely.
And this sort of gets to the point in your book about Burke and Paine, right? So one of the takeaways I got from that and from talking to you about it was that Paine is it's not really the father of the American left, but as sort of the avatar of the original, of the American left going back to before there was really in America. Left-wing movements tend to be about momentum towards the future, while right-wing movements or conservative movements tend to be about space, zones of freedom, protected places, English garden versus French garden, and all the stuff on the Remnant bingo card.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that because of that part of the conservative disposition must needs be looking backwards to a certain extent about where we came from and how much worse it could be, and that requires memory. While the utopian orientation looks towards the future and an imagined perfect society and holds it up as a yardstick against the present and finds the present wanting. And that liberates you from the shackles of remembering anything, because the whole point is you're not looking in the rearview mirror at anything. You're looking through the windshield at the supposed stuff beyond the horizon, and that kind of, I think, at the metaphysical level, gets a big chunk of the difference between the conservative and sort of utopian dispositions.
I think that's right. It begins maybe even deeper than that, in a kind of anthropology that, again, in a way, someone like Paine, someone like Burke might help us to articulate. They, left and right are foreign terms to them. Those don't necessarily mean anything. But the idea that some people start out in the world by seeing the good in it and seeing that the good didn't have to be there, because they recognize that the human person is fallen, is imperfect, is prone to brokenness, and therefore any example of human beings flourishing must point to some kind of social achievement that has to be appreciated and recognized, and inevitably points to the past in the sense that it's been achieved by generations of work, most likely. If you begin the other way, if you start by thinking the human person is ready for freedom and the only reason people don't flourish is because there are these institutions that stand in their way and oppress them, then what you see around you are sources of oppression that need to be overturned. And again, very roughly, very crudely, these are the ways in which progressives and conservatives tend to see the world. And to begin by seeing that things could be worse, and therefore by recognizing the good, I think is unavoidably also to recognize what's been achieved for us in the past that we didn't build. Whereas to begin by seeing the ways in which things aren't as good as they could be is to see the past as a source of oppression, as something to be overthrown. So it's not a coincidence that these tend to be conservative and progressive. I think they both look for progress. They disagree about the nature of progress, how it's achieved, and whether what it requires is a break from the past or a building on the best of the past. And obviously the latter is more inclined to gratitude. And so gratitude is just more naturally the disposition of people who start with a lower opinion of the human person, but a higher opinion of the social achievement that is a free society.
That reminds me. So, the Lewis and Lewis book on the myth of left and right.
Yes.
You were. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But you were less disposed to its thesis than I was, and I'm not particularly disposed to its thesis. I think the hard version of it is wrong, but the softer version has a lot of merit to it. It seems to me in the shrinking utility of the terms left and right. What made me think about it was you were talking about how obviously left and right were not terms that Burke and Paine knew, because literally they had not become terminological things until 20 years, 30 years after they were doing their stuff, right? Because it comes from the French estates in general. And it certainly didn't migrate into English discourse.
And even then, left and right come from the left. They're just terms that they're terms created later and for a different reason than we tend to imagine. But the concepts that they describe, I think, are very valuable. They're not completely explanatory. No simple framework like that could be. But I do think that in the politics of modern democracies, there really is a disagreement about the nature of the liberal society and whether it is a product of a break achieved by the Enlightenment or whether it is a product, a kind of culmination of Western civilization, and therefore not a break, but exactly a product of continuity. And we've come to describe those very broad sets of views as, roughly speaking, left and right. I think that there is always a relevant left-right axis in American political life, in the life of most modern liberal democracies. There is also at the same time an up-down axis, I would say, which is older. It's more fundamental to politics. Aristotle described it as the distinction between the few and the many. We might now think of it as something like elitism and populism. That's also always important, and it interacts in really complicated ways with the left and right. But I don't think you can understand the politics of our society or of most democracies without seeing that there is an up-down division and a left-right division. Very often, the party of the left is the down party, is the party of the people. In our time, it's not the only time this happened, but almost. In our time, the party of the right is the down party, is the party of the people. And that creates a very complicated kind of politics that I don't think we could possibly understand without seeing that up and down matter as much as they do, that populism and elitism are essential. But I also don't think we could understand it without recognizing that there's something to be learned from the distinction that we describe as left-right. Not everything can be learned from it, but it is useful.
On your understanding of the orientation towards the Enlightenment stuff, I'm going to push back a little bit, or at least I'm going to probe a little more on that. If that's the case, because one of the reasons why this came to mind was your point about left and right being foreign to Paine and Burke, but also the way the orientation of gratitude, believing that, this system is a system of oppression, or this is a system of essentially hard-won moral progress and political progress. There's the famous line from Rousseau, "Man is born free everywhere, but yet everywhere he is in chains." That is one of the classic iterations of what we would call a left-wing point of view, right?
Yeah.
Like the institutions are all systems of oppression. You can chart a straight, sometimes zigzagging, but pretty straight-ish line between that and the arguments of critical race theory, critical legal studies, all that kind of stuff. That man is born free and everywhere is in chains kind of thinking is very popular in what we call the right these days. And so, like, where do you put, if your schema has this thing about their orientation towards the Enlightenment, where is Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule and all these guys who have very harsh things to say about the Enlightenment?
Well, I think that, first of all, I do think that line of Rousseau's is very important as a kind of distinction on the sort of axis we're talking about. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. I like to contrast that with the line from the book of Job, that man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. That's roughly the opposite view of how man is born. And I do think those differences account for a lot of the fundamental left-right difference. And as I see them, I think of Patrick Deneen as agreeing with the right's view of that, agreeing with the idea that the human person is fallen, is prone to sin and to vice, and therefore requires formative institutions. I think that Patrick may be skeptical that liberal institutions could play that role, and that in a sense he thinks that the fact of human anthropology means that we can't actually be a liberal society and be a healthy society. I don't agree with that, precisely because I don't think that liberal institutions were an invention of the Enlightenment. I don't think John Locke invented England.
Right.
England came to be over a very gradual process that begins much earlier than that. You can look at Tocqueville's History of Democracy, which not only begins around the birth of Christ, but doesn't even stop to notice the Enlightenment in the introduction to democracy in America. It describes a gradual process that points in the direction of egalitarianism, but also of greater social order, and describes a kind of gradual evolution toward freedom that I think is closer to the truth than the notion that all of a sudden, in the early modern period, new ideas entirely about human life and politics emerged and made it possible to have an entirely new kind of society. By the time that those ideas emerged, there was already a free society, and John Locke describes it in the Second Discourse in a way that tries to offer a kind of justification of it without resort to Christian theology in any detail. I don't think that's liberalism. That's a kind of radical political theory that emerges as an explanation so that liberalism didn't need to ground itself in Christianity. But liberalism is grounded in Christianity. I mean, that's just as a historical matter, that's what it is. And in a sense, the debate that we have between liberals and post-liberals within the right is a debate about whether the left is correct or not about the nature of modern society. And Patrick says they are correct, and therefore we should reject modern society. I think they're just not. And the fact that the familiar theories of liberal rights describe a society that he wouldn't defend doesn't mean that we actually live in that society. We don't. And so I don't think we necessarily disagree about the basics of human anthropology. And I think we're both on the right, Patrick and I, but we don't agree about what liberalism actually is as a practical matter.
No, the point's well taken about Patrick. I think you're right that that the anthropology is similar because it's a Christian anthropology, or a Judeo-Christian anthropology, or a Western Civ
or Jewish anthropology.
Yeah,
yes.
or Jewish anthropology, right?
Yeah.
But so that's fair. At the same time, as you move away from the writings of Deneen or Vermeulen and towards actual politics as lived today, we're heading back towards my Rousseauian point, where there's a lot of imaginary paranoia about the deep state, about the elites, about the right has this thing which I've been calling critical Trump theory, where basically any argument that is critical of Trump or inconvenient to Trump is assumed to be bigoted against Trump and Trumpism and MAGA, the same way that any argument that is inconvenient to the arguments of sort of the Ibram Kendi left is just assumed to be objectively racist, right? Because there's no safe harbor. Either you're anti-racist or you're racist, and either you're pro-Trump or you're anti-Trump. And it's the same logic. And one of the things I like about this, analogy is that A, it kind of works, but B, it illustrates the degree to which a lot of these very complicated and supposedly deeply intellectual theories are really pretty juvenile. And it's a pretty good indictment of a lot of the critical race stuff, that it works just as well for theories of criticizing Donald Trump. But regardless, if you follow the way, the Kash Patels or the Don Juniors talk on Twitter about America as basically an oppressive state, and it is, I assume part of your answer is going to be that it's playing into the up-down part rather than the left-right part. But you can be so down in your schema that you might as well be on the left.
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. That larger and larger parts of the right are less and less conservative in this moment. And we're living in a time when I think the up-down axis is more prominent in defining our politics, and people understand where they belong more on the basis of populism and elitism than on the basis of more traditional kinds of left-right differences. And absolutely, there's a lot of populism that is almost inherently hostile to conservatism because it is hostile to establishments, and conservatism is protective of established things. And so to say that that the status quo is inherently oppressive is to say that the inherited order of things is to be rejected, and that's a way of thinking that we tend to identify with the left. It's more traditional, in some ways more logical, for populism to be on the left than on the right. And in most instances in American history, when we've seen populism emerge with real force, it has emerged on the left and not on the right. Generally speaking, the right has identified itself with the institutions of society. Even when it doesn't run them, it sees itself as trying to save them from the people who are running them, to save the courts from the judges, to save the university from the professors. And so identifies itself with core institutions that are necessary for the formation of free people. And I think we do run the risk now, in a moment when the right is very populist, of a kind of separation from those, in a sense that formation is not necessary, that in fact it's unjust. And that's not just populist, that's anti-conservative, and I think ultimately very dangerous. There are a lot of ways in which a populist right is exceptionally dangerous, just as an elitist left is exceptionally dangerous, because the populist right leaves the institutions undefended. The left isn't going to defend them, and if the right isn't either, then no one is. I think in the same way, the left is not well equipped to actually think about being in charge, and therefore tends to be pretty reckless and unconstrained. And that's more or less a description of our politics right now. So have a nice day.
That's an opportunity for a segue to bring this down to a little closer to the earth. So I don't know if you've been following this kerfuffle about Ezra Klein all of a sudden realizing, I mean, this is my imputation of his realization rather than the way he would express it, that he's been part of the problem for the last 20 years. And basically the subtext is Yuval Levin and Ramesh Ponnuru and Jonah Goldberg were right. Again, that's my characterization. He would consider that somewhat unfair, but his problem is that he's got this great line in this piece in the New York Times where he says, I don't want to defend these institutions. I want them to work. Right. And so all of a sudden and I think he's speaking for a big chunk of the more reasonable left, which I don't think Ezra was always part of.
Yeah.
That, holy crap, and I just wrote my LA Times column of this, we spent way too much time talking about defending the authority of experts rather than trying to fight for the competency of them. Right. And so there was this priestly caste kind of way that we talked about experts. And the problem was that the expert classes became essentially a guild where they were protecting their interests and their status more than they were actually delivering the things that we want from experts. And I think this got blown up during COVID in particular, where you now can't talk about experts as having authority anymore in our sort of culture, political culture, because they beclown themselves, because they abused, sort of the treason of the clerks and kind of thing for experts. And, what do people actually want from government is like, well, they want the schools to actually educate people, not protect teachers' jobs, not to protect teachers' salaries, not to spread ideological stuff, but like to do math and English and that kind of thing. What do they want from police? Is they want them to fight crime. What do they want from like housing policies? They want affordable housing. And these things that government is supposed to do, or at least they think the government is supposed to do, they got distracted by the sort of internal agendas of what Schumpeter or Irving Kristol would call the new class types, right? The managerial class types, as Burnham would call them. And so it seems to me like there's this moment for making arguments about actually results-based government policy again. I just don't think that the Trump administration is necessarily going to seize upon it. But I think this perception or this desire for actually just doing your job is probably what got Trump elected, or at least got what Harris defeated.
Well, I think that's right. And first of all, I should clearly start reading Ezra Klein more if he says we were right now. That would be
Again, it's implied. It's the esoteric significant silences.
We can do a close reading. I think there's a lot of truth to how you put this, but I would say that there's a missing element of it, which is it certainly seems to me like the American public is asking for something it isn't getting in the 21st century. And that's why we constantly have change elections. That's why all the politicians are good at winning as challengers, but not as incumbents. We've now had, this will be the third one-term presidency in a row. That hasn't happened since the 19th century. I think the question is still, though, what is it that people are asking for that they aren't getting? And Republicans and Democrats have their very different theories about this that seem to both be wrong, because the public just keeps saying the same thing, which is essentially no thank you. And the no thank you is interpreted by the winning party, the challenger, as wanting what he's offering. He then produces that, and the public again says no thank you. And I think what you describe, Ezra Klein and others, is getting at is close to how I think about what the public is looking for but isn't getting, but not quite. I increasingly think that what Americans are looking for is some sense of control over chaotic forces. What they're tired of is the sense that they're just subject to forces that no one is in control of. And so the economy just does stuff, and it doesn't seem like economic policy matters. You read the Fed minutes, and you could just summarize them all as, I don't know, we'll see what happens. The world is chaotic and out of control, and American foreign policy seems to have no way of exerting any control whatsoever over events. We don't even know what we want, what we're not achieving. What do we want from our relationship with China or with Iran? Nobody can tell you. I think more generally, the sense that things are out of control is expressed in various kinds of failures of government on the one hand. This is true of immigration. I don't think the American public has a particular level of immigration that they all want. They want the sense that somebody is deciding what the level is, and then that is the level. And that is not happening. Immigration is just out of control. It's not too high or too low. I think people have this sense, on the other hand, as sometimes elites are too strong and overbearing and leave them out of control over the culture that shapes their children's lives, out of control over school curriculum. Things just happen thanks to these forces from a distance. And I think the next effective, successful political coalition will offer people some degree of greater control over crime on the streets, over marijuana everywhere you go, over your children's schools, the technology that they're exposed to and you're exposed to, and over immigration and the direction of foreign policy and economic policy. That's a complicated desire because it doesn't quite point in either party's preferred direction. It says that elites are both too strong and not competent enough, which is a very complicated message to parse. And Donald Trump is not the answer to that desire because he's an agent of chaos, not of control. But it may be that there are people behind Trump, more on the right than on the left, who increasingly gather that this is kind of what people are asking for. I think that Ezra Klein is getting at that a little bit, at the sense that people just look at one party and say, well, they're not capable of doing this. They look at the other party and say, they're not capable of doing this. And it seems like no one is really rising to offer what people want. There's a kind of market failure in our party system now. I think it's a good thing to see that people like Ezra are realizing that some of what they've been pushing is part of the problem. I think it would take some more steps. I mean, in my view, some of what it would take for government to be more effective at delivering for people would require some decentralization of decision making, some market forces in allocating resources, traditional kinds of conservative ideas that aren't even popular on the right anymore, and that I think are actually essential to solving the kinds of problems they describe. But that this market failure is happening, I think, is undeniable. There are a lot of people around Trump now who want to read this election as a great affirmation of what he was offering. But I think it is the public saying no, again, just as it did to him, saying no to his successor. And it's very important that that not be misread as a yes to the peculiar kind of weird combination of ideas that his coalition now stands for. Those aren't particularly popular either. And the risk of using power to make yourself unpopular is at least as strong for Trump as it was for Biden.
Yeah, I mean I think it's pretty obvious that when you start looking over the last quarter century, right, and usually political epochs, eras, periods don't line up perfectly with the calendar, right? The 1960s doesn't really get started until like 67 and then doesn't end till like 75, but we call that the 60s. It's very useful that this last quarter century basically starts in the year 2000 with the Florida, right? That's where we get red versus blue. That gets locked in as this sort of tribal understanding. It's not black and white, but it's black and white thinking. And when you look back on it, it seems to me that part of the reason for this tie thing, which we've both talked about a lot, we've both written about a lot, is that each party first of all, they think there's such a thing as a mandate. There isn't such a
Yeah.
thing as a mandate, except in the most figurative, colloquial sense. And they let the people, the most committed ideologues, define the mandate, and then they act on it, and they lose the support of the marginal voters who made their majority in the first place. I went back and I looked at that hidden tribe study that came out in 2018, and the richest, whitest 14% of America, like 8%, 8 or 9%, they call them devoted progressives or committed progressive activists, and then there's about 6 or 7% that are devoted conservatives. They're the richest, the whitest group, and they're the people who basically dominate the primary system, dominate cable news, dominate the narrative formation stuff. And then there's this vast majority of Americans, they call them the exhausted majority, and they have different categories. They kind of just want government to do the things that they think government is supposed to do, not be transformational, not, go back in time or go forward in time and that kind of stuff. But they don't have the capacity to affect the narrative. They're not the donor base. They're not the symbol manipulators, the idea mongers, and it would require pissing off the people inside the bubble with you to go after those median voters with just a simple sort of, like, I keep thinking, remember we were on an email chain about this a long time ago. Nat Glazer gave this speech where he talked about how the problem with cities is they stopped doing the things they knew how to do and started doing the things they didn't know how to do. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole on that. And it goes back to The Limits of Social Policy, a book he wrote in the early 70s, which makes a similar point that, like, government's only good at a handful of things, and so it should focus on those things. But the problem is you get the Obama people wanting fundamental transformation of America, which is hard enough for churches to do. It's really hard for the White House to do. And then you have the sort of time traveling, make America great again, or make America the New Deal again, which is what waylaid Biden.
I think there's also a confusion about the nature of elections and the nature of governing, especially in the American system, where, Hamilton makes this case in the Federalist in 72 and 76 that what winning the election gives you is a chance to prove yourself. But we've now come to think that winning the election is the proof. And you won the election, and therefore you've been asked to transform the universe. But in fact, winning the election is a chance to govern, and people judge their leaders by how they govern. And that's an opportunity to build a coalition, right? When you win, you can show more voters that you're here for them, that you can help them. And there's a kind of incentive in governing to force you to look to that middle, even though they're not the people with the money, they're not the people with the printing press and the microphone. The way that our politics now understands the incentives it confronts, people think in more parliamentary terms, that winning the election is the key moment. That win has therefore given you a mandate to pursue what you promised to do. And therefore, it's only the activists who really matter after the election. Those are the people you're trying to satisfy. Those are the people you're trying to prove yourself to. And that's just not a good way to govern in the American system. And both parties have fallen into a place where that's how they understand what elections mean to them. So neither of them is really trying to prove themselves to new voters when they're governing, which is ultimately how you build a coalition.
So let's get now for the rank punditry portion of this podcast. It's very difficult to do rank punditry in this period because you never know which nominee is going to withdraw, from consideration by the time this podcast goes out. But how are you feeling about the Trump cabinet as it is so far?
It's a mix. I think one striking thing about it is that it has all been named very, very quickly, much faster than any other time that I can remember. And I think one way to read that is that they were ready. Another way to read that is that this is being done impulsively. Mm-hmm. And it's a little hard to know, but I think the latter is more true. It seems like Trump is naming people without much of a process, and in some cases even to the surprise of his own team. That seemed to be true about Gates. I also think that if you look at the peculiar combination of people he has named, it's possible to see that as a kind of coalition logic. Aside from Matt Gaetz, who thankfully has withdrawn, the people he's named are kind of the different pieces of his coalition. He really owes a debt to Robert Kennedy Jr., who actually brought voters. I think Trump would not have won the popular vote, for example, if RFK Jr. had not dropped out of the race. And so that's a real debt, and I think he's trying to pay that debt by giving him the cabinet post he wanted. There are others who are just kind of part of the range of people, so that both Marco Rubio and Tulsi Gabbard are named at the same time, even though they point in very different directions on foreign policy, because that's kind of what the coalition looks like. But I do think there's also a strange logic here about the role of these top officials, where people who are fundamentally critics of something in particular about an institution are put in a position of running the entire institution. That's a strange way to think about administration. I do think that the Pentagon should hear Pete Hegseth's critiques of its wokeism, but whether that means that Hegseth should run the Pentagon, the whole of it, is another story entirely. And the person who is criticizing some excess in a bureaucracy, even if he's right, is not always the right person to run that bureaucracy. That's a very different thing. I think we see that over and over. And, in some ways, most peculiarly around defense and HHS. The most fascinating pick to me is RFK Jr. at HHS, where there's so many reasons for Republicans to reject him, whether it's abortion or the ag senators not liking where he is on pesticides, or just the fact that he's a total crackpot nutjob who has all these conspiracies about vaccines and wants to be HHS secretary. And yet I think that he has a decent shot of getting through, and they're being pretty strategic about it by having him select senior officials for the other HHS agencies, the people who will run CMS or the Centers for Disease Control or the FDA, are being chosen, interviewed by Kennedy and his people as if he's already in charge. That's interesting. That's not really something we normally see. And we'll see. I hope Kennedy doesn't get through. I think some of those sub picks have been good. Marty McCary to run the FDA is a perfectly reasonable pick. Some of them have been very strange. Is Dr. Oz really going to run CMS? I mean, does he know what that job is? It's just doing a lot of math in Baltimore. Not sure they've thought that through. But, broadly speaking, I think there's an odd sense of what administrators do at the center of a lot of this that is going to have to get worked out one way or another. But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, like with Pete Hegseth, I think he's a bad pick. I don't think he's a disastrous pick.
Right.
I would have no problem with some basic proper Secretary of Defense hiring Pete Hegseth to be a recruitment and anti-wokeism czar at the Department of the Defense. I mean, do I think it's the highest, best use of department resources to have a huge campaign about that? I don't know. I'm open to it one way or the other. But so much of that job is logistical, manpower allotment, that kind of stuff. How do I get, a pallet of toilet paper from, Peoria to Baghdad in 24 hours, that kind of thing,
and so much of what needs to change now is about procurement, is about these complicated processes. I think this is true beyond the Pentagon. Administration ultimately requires persistent focus on large problems that involve small steps to change the process. That's just what it is. It's inherently a very mundane thing. Administration just is that. And so saying big things is actually a fairly small part of effectively changing bad bureaucracies. These are bad bureaucracies, but to change them, you'd need people who know how they work, where they're not working well, and who'd be able to stay on that problem for an extended period of time. That's not what Donald Trump is good at. The things he did well when he was president are the things that least required persistent focus, right? Naming judges is the least executive part of the president's job. You just pick somebody, and then literally for the rest of their life, they just do good work without you having to do anything about it. But everything else did not go well. And I think the logic here suggests that that lesson has not been learned, and that the fact that what it would take to change the Pentagon is someone who knows the ways in which the processes of decision making have to change and has the tenacity, the focus to change those. That's really what it would take at HHS. That's what it would take at the Pentagon, at DOJ. I think it's, at least for the moment, it doesn't look like that's how these folks are being selected. We'll see who's under them. We'll see what kind of things they end up trying to do. But the very idea of what administration is kind of has to be rediscovered. And I think that's true in a lot of recent presidential administrations, but it's especially striking under Trump, in this time and last time.
I mean, the irony is actually the example that is most on your point, which I agree with, isn't picking judges. It's Operation Warp Speed.
Yes, right.
Right? Here's a thing where they understood that the normal processes were insufficient to the needs at the moment, and they're like, screw the normal processes. Let's come up with an incentive structure that gets something to the market, to the public, not necessarily the market, as rapidly and as safely as possible. And the irony is that Trump can't talk about Operation Warp Speed, right, which was arguably, I think, the most impressive thing his administration did. And it should be something to brag about, but it runs crosswise with that up-down and left-right issue in all sorts of ways.
I think that's right. Now, it did require some real administrative ability. I mean, it was put together by a lot of people who had spent their lives in these bureaucracies and understood how they work. Frankly, a lot of it came from Tony Fauci, who you really can't talk about
right,
for all kinds of reasons, some of which are perfectly appropriate. But I do think that ultimately it does take some insider knowledge to fix the problems that happen on the inside. I mean, look, I have a lot of problems with how Fauci functioned in the course of the pandemic, but I think the two greatest achievements of American government in the 21st century have been PEPFAR, which saved millions of lives in Africa, and Operation Warp Speed, both of which were basically designed by Tony Fauci, a career insider, if there ever was one. So I think you have to recognize the importance of those kinds of skills, but put them to use in a way that that delivers for the priorities you have. That's what it takes for administrative leadership to work. And, I don't think we see that at this point.
So let's say, I'm sure this has happened. I'm not working from facts, but I would be shocked if it hasn't happened to you already. Because if it's happened to me, it must have happened to you. Some young, intrepid, policy wonk guy, qualified, says, I have an opportunity, or I might have an opportunity to go into the administration. I'm very worried about what the administration might do. I'm very worried about what it might mean for my career. I'm very worried about who they might pick if I don't go in. What do you tell them?
Well, basically, I would say that you should be open to going into a job where you think you could do some good, and a job you'd find interesting and engaging. It depends some on exactly where and how close to Donald Trump it is. I think to work at the White House, you should have some respect for Donald Trump. And if you don't, you really shouldn't work there. I don't think people should work for the president who see it as their job to restrain or stop or hold back the president. I hope there are such people around him in a sense, but I don't think it's fair to him, who was elected president, to have people working for him who just believe that they're there to undo the fact that he was president. So if that's somebody's attitude, I just don't think that person will succeed in such a job. I think it'll drive them crazy, and I don't think that it's right. But if you've been asked to work at the State Department and it's what you know and what you care about, and you think you could do some good, but you're just not sure ultimately what you'll think of the administration's policy, I think it makes sense to do that job, to be ready to leave it if you get to a place where it seems like you want no part of what it's doing. But we need good people in government. Every administration needs good people, and I think it's I think it's reasonable to have those kinds of questions, but also that it's reasonable to do those jobs. And even at the White House, look, I certainly have had some people ask for advice who just have a different attitude about Donald Trump than I do. I could never work for Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean nobody ever should. And so I certainly think that we're well served by high quality people doing these very important jobs, and to stay out of spite is really not a way to do public service. What do you tell them, Joe?
I have a friend who you know, but we will not name names, who was up for a very senior job in kind of a dream job in the first Trump administration. And it's the kind of job that he, been working on for, it would be the culmination of the work he'd been doing for a very long time. And his wife said to him, okay, we can do this. We can pull the kids out of school. We can rearrange our life. We can go do this. But you've got to promise me one thing, that you are confident Trump won't do something in the first 2 weeks or 2 months that will require you to resign. Because otherwise, what's the point of doing it?
You can't be sure of that. Yeah.
And he's like, damn you, your perfectly reasonable concerns, and didn't take the job. And that would be my, that would be one of my biggest concerns. And that's not necessarily going to be the case for every job, but for some jobs, there is a non-trivial chance, at DOJ or NSC or one of these kinds of places, that you're going to be asked or expected to do something that you should not do.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people should be very clear with themselves if they're thinking about that kind of thing. Should be very clear that moment can happen. It's true under any president, but it is just more likely to be true under this president than usual. And you have to be prepared for that.
So where are you these days on just sort of the future of conservatism? Because I take your point about the coalition part, and I've been complaining for 15 years now that people think we live in a parliamentary democracy, and once you win an election, you get to do whatever you want, and it's not how it works. I might as well have a sandwich board and a cowbell telling everyone to buy your book. But, I think it was Ross Douthat recently made the similar coalition point on Twitter, and as a matter of analysis, I have no problem with it. I get vexed by the fact that the most, to use your typology, the most populist, down, right-wing but not conservative people have taken the conservative label and used it as a loyalty test for loyalty to Donald Trump as part of this sort of critical Trump theory kind of thing. And so the very idea of a coalitional administration, coalitional government, which again is not how our system is designed. But if you're going to use it metaphorically or as a heuristic to understand, these appointments, it would be very helpful if I wasn't told that that true conservatives have to support Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being HHS secretary. But that's where we are for a big chunk of the right these days that does not care about the terminological, exactitude on this stuff.
I agree with that. I think there is room for coalitional thinking in the parties, and the Republican Party has to understand itself as a coalition of somewhat different groups. And among those groups are more tradition-minded conservatives and more traditional type conservatives that I take myself to be one, and who are not fundamentally populists. There are ways in which populism can achieve good things, but I'm, to begin with, a conservative, and in that sense, critical of some very basic elements of populism in American life. I think that it's very hard for factions, self-conscious factions, to function now in our party system. In part because the parties are at 50-50, there's an intense pressure for party loyalty, and a sense that if you're articulating a different kind of sub-view within the larger party, then you're a traitor to that larger party. the test of loyalty has become a matter of personal loyalty to Donald Trump, which makes it even harder since there's no real ideological coherence to what he offers most of the time. And to the extent that there is, it is a kind of populism. And so I think conservatives are in a tough spot. That said, I think the work to be done to help drag the party where we can in our direction has to be a kind of coalitional work. And the peculiar thing about this moment for that purpose, from the point of view of building out constructive factions, is that coalitional work in the 21st century has been very top-down work. It does not begin from groups of voters out in the country who gradually build up institutions and then come to be represented. It often begins from politicians. The Trump movement itself has essentially no bottom-up component. It's a top-down political movement. And I think you see that in the different factions to the extent that they exist now of the left and right, which means that conservatives of a traditional sort, like me, like you, who want to be influential on the direction of the Republican Party, would need some politicians to agree and to be willing to play that role. I think it's a tremendous challenge right now. There's an opportunity there for some ambitious politicians, especially if they see that Donald Trump is term limited. He is 78 and he is a lame duck, and it makes sense to think a little bit about what comes after him one way or another. I think there is a prospect for something more like a coalitional approach to party politics at that point, but I'm not sure. And it's easier for me to take a risk on that front than for an elected official to take a risk on that front. So the challenge is very real, but I think it makes sense for us on the right to understand where we fit in the party in a way that doesn't assume that everybody's the same. The peculiar thing about coalition politics in this moment, there are coalitions, there are factions, there are differences, but rather than beginning by highlighting their differences and then negotiating, they begin by highlighting where they can agree with Donald Trump. And so they all pretend that they agree about everything, when in fact, they all know they don't agree about many things. But all they say out loud is the part that they agree with Donald Trump about. And that means that some of the real factional lines of division in the Republican Party now are intentionally kept under the surface, and it becomes very hard for them to play a part in shaping our politics. I don't think that's a permanent condition. I think it makes sense to be doing some of the work that will be useful when that's no longer the case. But obviously, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, the example of this that I always keep thinking about is the incredible damage that Donald Trump has done to the pro-life movement. That the pro-life movement does not, for understandable reasons, really want to acknowledge or talk about. But Donald Trump is effectively made the Republican Party a pro-choice party. It is less pro-choice than the Democratic Party.
Right.
But if you were a head of a pro-life organization prior to the election, there's a very rational, self-serving argument to say you would have been better off if Trump lost. Because now Trump has demonstrated that you can have essentially a pro-choice position. You know, it's not pro-choice the way the left wants to define it, but it is pro-choice it's a federalist pro-choice position. It's like pro-choice by state. And which is actually weirdly my position. But,
I think it's worth seeing how different that is from the way that the Republican Party has generally worked around issues like this. I remember working for George W. Bush on abortion and related issues as a White House staffer, and he was constantly subject to intense criticism,
right,
which was true, but was marginal because Bush was a very personally pro-life, practically pro-life, politically pro-life president. But the way in which the groups kept him from straying was by always criticizing him. And that made sense. That's coalition politics. They did the same thing to Ronald Reagan. Those same groups now work in a very different way. They will decline to talk about the things they disagree with Donald Trump about, which means the change to the party platform on abortion was just kind of quietly accepted by the pro-life groups, when their job, their reason for being for the last 50 years has been to prevent that very thing from happening. But they came to the view that they could not survive if they openly oppose Trump, even though he was openly opposing them. And obviously, it's not possible for a political coalition to operate that way. You have to make demands on one another. That's the only way for coalitional forces to function. And so the question is whether this is going to persist in the wake of Trump. And my sense is that it will not and cannot, but we can't be sure of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that you can't be sure. Nothing's guaranteed. But if Donald Trump departs this mortal coil sooner rather than later, or if he finishes out his term and says goodbye to politics, I don't know that J.D. Vance can play the same kind of games with, or Ron DeSantis or any of these kinds of people. They don't have the weird pull and on the voters and the right-wing media in the same way. So I think coalitional politics will be much stronger and healthier when Trump is out of the picture. That said, it's going to take the pro-life movement, a generation just to get back to the status quo ante that they had. And, there's only one issue left that could, for Trump to test, and that's guns. Right. I mean, like I would have, it would have been a 50-50 call about whether he could do it on abortion. He did it on abortion and pulled it off. Be kind of interesting to see whether the gun rights crowd would tolerate a similar kind of adjustment on Second Amendment stuff. I
think in this moment he probably could do it. I suspect that that becomes more and more difficult with time as people do come to realize that he's term limited and a lame duck, but we'll see.
So we should close out just very quickly for all of this sort of dire talk about the health of conservatism. It seems to me that the left is in a pretty bad place as well. And so there's some solace to be taken in that. I mean, I feel like I think the catastrophism about wokeness, as much as I disagree with a lot of that stuff, and a lot of that stuff I think is really pernicious, and I'm profoundly offended by some of it. At the same time, I don't think it justified the kind of rhetoric that it has generated on the right. But that said, one gets the sense that the lessons about Latinx and DEI and the they-them ad with Kamala Harris, that has been very well internalized. Like Roy Teixeira is another guy who gets to say, see, I was right. Where do you think the left goes next? I know you don't have the same.
I agree with that. I mean, I think wokeism is very bad and deserves all it gets, and it does seem to be kind of getting what it deserves. I guess the question for me is whether that in fact lasts. There was a period after 2016, too, where the left seemed to be trying to learn something about itself and then decided, actually, no, let's just go all in and that'll work for us. There will be rough times ahead for the right. That's just where we seem to be headed with the way that the Trump folks look to be governing. And so I think there will be opportunities for the left to fail to learn what this election is trying to teach it, if that's what they want to do. I would say, I think on the whole, the reaction to the election on the left so far seems to be less hysterical and more serious than it was in 2016. Yeah. And I hope that means that people really are learning that actually the country doesn't want what we're offering. It is essential that they see that. I think it's also important that the right not imagine that what the country is asking for is exactly what the right is offering. But losing an election does have to teach you something. The challenging thing about our elections in the 21st century is that the losses are real and the wins are not. The public is saying no. And in the next election, it again says no. And the party that is told no has to take the no for an answer. The trouble is the other party isn't really getting told yes. And so I think when they defeated Trump in 2020, the left just decided, well, okay, we're back on course for the rising Democratic majority, and that just wasn't what the country was saying. I hope they're internalizing that now. I think so far the signs are okay on that front, and there are ways to keep the pressure up. I think there are real opportunities on higher education. I think there are some opportunities in the culture in general, because there are some people on the left who didn't like it, who didn't like the woke turn, who thought it was crazy, but that they had to do it. And now they think, maybe we don't have to do it. Let's not do it. And you can almost feel that on some college campuses and in some cultural precincts of the left. But I don't know. The election was just a few weeks ago. We'll see if it persists.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me it's a sort of a symbolic thing, but the left reaction to the fact that the most persuasive, most effective, most widely used ad by the Trump campaign was that just showing a clip of Kamala Harris talking about,
Yep.
state-funded transgender surgeries for criminal illegal immigrants, which is just so perfect. And I think there are two left-wing reactions to it. One is the easier one, the sort of MSNBC one, which is to be like, they won on bigotry, right? And then there's the reason why I think that ad was effective. I mean, it was effective by appealing to the Yahoo crowd that just hates wokeism and the transgender stuff. And I get that, and I'm not trying to mock them about it, but like, they were going to vote for Trump no matter what, right? The people are really turned to 11 about the transgender stuff and all that. It also worked on the lightly engaged voter who said, oh, she's one of these people that cares more about that kind of thing than doing the job, right? It was an anti-competency thing subliminally. And the people on the left who get that, of like, the lesson here isn't so much that you have to be anti-trans, it's that you actually just have to have some sort of prioritization about the things that normal people actually want from government and from politics. And it's not that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I don't think it was necessarily an endorsement of the mirror image of that on trans issues. It was an endorsement of the sense that this just isn't what our president should be doing.
Right.
And yeah, I hope that lesson can be internalized, and in a sense by both parties. But certainly it's a lesson the left has to learn, just for the sake of our culture, wherever their political standing goes.
All right, so I teased it at the beginning. It just occurred to me, and I should bring it back around to Thanksgiving for a second. Then you're free to go, I promise. So a lot of listeners and readers have a problem with my distinction between nationalism and patriotism. And I keep trying to say this is less about etymology, because patria goes back to the fatherland, and it basically means nationalism at some point in the lexicon and all that. My point is that they point to, I'm using them as stand-ins for two different ways of thinking about America, right? And part of my argument would be Thanksgiving versus the 4th of July. Thanksgiving is, when I said earlier that it's a nationalist holiday, it's really about a covenant with God.
Yeah.
It's a holiday that predates, in many respects, the actual founding of this country. It is about those things that are really close to hearth and home and soul, family, food, friends, that kind of thing. Again, a covenant with God, and about gratitude for just the providence of the Almighty, and of having and being grateful for the good things. It's giving thanks. 4th of July, it's a party about a friggin' document where we celebrate the birth of this country through a text, and it is about celebrating some very specific, laid out philosophical. I mean, Constitution Day would be a better example of this, but 4th of July is like the most patriotic holiday, and because it's about a relationship, it's celebrating a specific founding of a kind of regime. And Thanksgiving is about sort of a more mystical, sort of poetic thing. Anyway, is there a better way of explaining this distinction than nationalism versus patriotism? Is it gratitude versus transactionalism or something? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I have more patience, more time for nationalism as a term, as a concept than you might. But I like the distinction. I think in a way it's a distinction between love and affirmation, right? Thanksgiving is an expression of love, and gratitude very often is a response to and a way of approaching the things we love. Whereas the Fourth of July is more about an affirmation of a set of commitments and beliefs. It's more rational. Um, Lincoln says in his eulogy for Henry Clay that he loved his country because it was his country, but also because it was a free country. And those are two different reasons. And I do think they describe two different sources of a love of home. And in the United States, they're both very powerful. There is an idea here, not just an idea, but a history of a commitment to a certain understanding of what a free society should be and is. But there's also home, and home is always going to move you to gratitude. And I think Thanksgiving is more about home. It's more about loving what's yours and being grateful for it. And the Fourth of July, is more about affirmation than about that kind of love. It's more about saying yes to it. Thanksgiving isn't really asking you to say yes. You've already said yes. It's already said yes to you. It's about being grateful for something you don't really deserve, and for getting more than you give in life. And in some ways, we just all do. That's what we're most grateful for at the end of the day. And so I think it runs deeper. And I do agree the distinction is helpful. It's a very American holiday, but it's not a political holiday.
Right.
Even if the first instance of it is a proclamation from George Washington, that's not really the first instance of it. And it obviously reaches further than that towards something that isn't just about a political idea, but that's about our home.
Yuval Levin, thank you so much for doing this. I could, of course, go on
Thank
longer,
you, Jonah.
but we got things to do. It's Thanksgiving week, and always great to have you.